All right. I would like to encourage all of you to kind of come into the space, please, and join us for the beginning of our final salon of the year. And I'm going to invite our panelists to also start making their way towards the pseudo-podium here. All right. So, good evening to all of you. Thank you all very much for joining us for this final salon. The series, of course, has looked at our shortage on affordable housing. My name is Sonia Chow. I'm the Associate Dean for Research here at the School of Architecture. And on behalf of Dean El-Khoury and all of us at the School of Architecture, I welcome you to our campus and to our school and to this space where we hope to start the conversation through a panel discussion of experts that are joining us. And then later on, we open it up to a Q&A. And in the end, we've always invited our panelists to stay behind and actually continue the conversations with all of you. So please join us on the back side of that so we can continue these important conversations about our shortage of affordable housing in South Florida. So I'm going to welcome up to the stage Madeline Lee and Gloria Shanahan, who have co-curated the series. Gloria is with the local office of the U.S. Department of HUD, and Madeline Lee is a member of the School of Architecture. So I'll let them introduce our moderator, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Sonia. We wanted to also just share a little bit about the series of salons that have that are culminating with this one. Gloria, maybe you can speak a bit about the topics that we've already explored, and then we'll bring our panel up.
Okay, good evening. Yes, we started with the macro issues, right? Like, how is policy affecting the solution of finding more affordable housing? Is it working, and what is happening out there? The second one came into the finances. What do we lose when we lose affordable housing? How are the challenges, are the opportunities to bring more of it? The third week, we talk about the social fabric in the urban core. What's happening? How do you retain a community as such when you are redeveloping an area that is in a lot of need? And then last week was fascinating about us thinking out of the box and designs for affordable housing, and with examples from all over the country. And today, well, our elephant in the room, we cannot avoid changing with the climate that is evolving so rapidly. So those were the topics.
So tonight, our topic is how is climate change compounding the affordable housing shortage, and it will be moderated by Michael Berkowitz, who is the executive founding director of the Climate Resilience Academy here at the university, and he will introduce our panelists. So, Michael and panelists, you can come on up.
Hello. I'm Michael Berkowitz, as Maddie said, with the University of Miami's Climate Resilience Academy, and thrilled to be moderating this salon panel on the intersection of climate and affordability, specifically how is climate change compounding the housing affordability shortage. So we have 4 great panelists here, so let me start our left to right. So Sonia Chow needs no introduction, but she's the Associate Dean of Research at the UM School of Architecture and holds a secondary appointment at the College of Engineering. Hannah Eskra is the President of Murray Development Partners and the Vice President of Real Estate Development at the Preservation of Affordable Housing. Welcome. Amy Knowles, CRO in Miami Beach. Good friend, and Alex Bogdanoff is a scientist and co-founder at Brizaga, which assists homeowners, businesses, and communities facing sea level rise and long-term environmental changes. He's got a lot of different roles. He's also advisor to the American Flood Coalition, so he's going to be our resident scientist today. So the way we're going to set this up a little bit is we'll talk and try to frame out the problem to begin with, and how climate is impacting affordability, and then we'll talk a little bit about some solutions. And then, but we do want to make this a multi-directional conversation, so we're going to be sure to leave enough time for comments, questions, and points of view. I think you can submit questions one of two ways. You can either scan the QR code there and Maddie will sort through them, or you can, when the mic gets passed around, just ask them in real time. So but please start thinking about those questions and comments now. This will be much more enriching if it's a multi-directional conversation. So with that, Sonia, let me throw it open to you. You've talked a lot about this climate gentrification. How do you see this trend evolving? What is climate gentrification to start with, and how do you see this trend evolving?
Thank you, Michael. So we do need to distinguish between segregation, gentrification, and climate gentrification. Segregation has unfortunately been a part of our history, as it has been in many cities across the United States, and that was sort of put into place in South Florida in particular as Henry Flagler started to bring the railroad down, and many of the workers had to live near that railroad track. And we know that that was partially very pragmatic on his part, but it was also because of the segregationist laws of the time, which required that those communities of color live away from the colonizers or the settlers that were here. And so over time, that of course meant that we had very distinct neighborhoods that were either all of color or partially thereof, and you can see how they were starting to map this in the 1990s. If we go to the next slide, we can see how these communities that evolved as a part of that process of segregation along the railroad had true identities to them. They were communities that became today's Overtown. They were other communities that we had, Brownsville, Upalaka, and other communities that were on the spurs of the FEC, including Hialeah. And so this is where we had some redlining activity, of course, that further underlined how we identified in a community and where we were financing projects and where we weren't. And more recently, thanks to some of the initiatives that were connected to our understanding that we couldn't continue to expand into the western areas of our community, into the wetlands any longer, controlling our urban development line, and then coming back to the Eastward Ho proposals from then Governor Jeb Bush, a lot of gentrification started to emerge as more and more people were interested in living in these historic communities for a variety of reasons, including that at the time the real estate in those neighborhoods was rather low, but also because they were very walkable communities. And so this was particularly attractive to older individuals and to young generations. And then more recently, if we look at if we intersect the map, if you can pull that up for us, we have a map where we illustrate where some of those historic neighborhoods were and where along that trajectory they intersect with, next, nope, you need to bring it up. Well, there's a map that we hopefully will get to show you where we've overlaid where these historic communities were and where the sea level rise is projected to continue to expand into our communities. And as my colleague Hal Wanless refers to us as the future Florida Keys, that in fact makes it very clear to not only developers but to all of us how certain parts of our community are going to continue to rise and appreciate in land value because of that imposition of rising seas.
Great. And Hannah, I do want to ask you about insurance and the role that plays in this trend, but first, maybe as someone who's in the developer world, do we think that developers are actually prioritizing higher ground now? Is the market that rational, or is this gentrification more generally?
So I will tell you that when I'm looking for land, X is my favorite letter, right? So X means that you are officially not in a floodplain. And I really do pay attention to that when I'm looking for land. I don't know that everybody does. So I'm doing it for the affordable housing world where my rents are restricted So if my insurance costs go up, I can't just raise my rents, right? We saw 30% increases in rents over the last couple of years, market rents. My rents cannot go up any more than what HUD allows me to go up, which is a couple of percentage points a year, right? So I do think in the affordable world, we're paying a little more attention to it, and particularly because our federal funds are making us pay attention to it. So if we're using federal funds, we do need to be really careful about where we're building and where the flood zones are. Do I think on the market rate side right now? I really don't. I'm not hearing that out in the market rate world right now.
And Alec, why don't you talk a little bit about how you're seeing people use flood risk and other climate risk data to make these kind of, I mean, part of this is about rational decision making and how the market starts to price risk. How are you seeing that from where you sit?
I mean, I'd wholeheartedly agree. I think right now folks are just trying to find land and they don't care where that land is for the most part. If they can aggregate enough to build the development they need, that's what they're doing. I think what we're seeing is on the back end, once they have that parcel and they realize, hey, I'm in a flood zone, or Broward County has something called the Future Conditions Groundwater Map. I'm going to take a moment to explain that, but basically we expect our ground, when it rains, the water basically eventually goes into the ground. As sea levels rise, that groundwater comes up too. That's actually probably the biggest threat we have in the near term for most of our community. Miami Beach is a little different. But what that means is you need to plan for future sea level rise in how much rain you hold on site. And when you do that and you add 2 feet of sea level rise, it becomes a lot more water you have to retain on site in kind of an engineered way, and your cost goes through the roof to build. And so what we're seeing is we have a lot of forward-thinking local governments here that are actually imposing, I don't want to use imposing because that's kind of a negative connotation, but they have forward-thinking policies that are making folks think about what the future is going to look like, and that is changing the cost to develop. And so once a developer goes through that once, we tend to see them think about it more in the future.
And Amy, from a Miami Beach perspective, you were telling me that you've seen a massive reduction in applications for flood insurance over the last year. What do you attribute that to? And walk us through a little bit of that, because in part that could be a signal of folks who are feeling the pinch financially and deciding to forego insurance.
Yeah, well, sure, Michael, and I hate to upset you over there, but all of Miami Beach is pretty much in a flood zone, and we have a very little.
I don't build on Miami Beach. I was going to say
we have
that.
a very little X area, but really 97% of our land area is in a special flood hazard area. So flood insurance is required if you have a federally backed mortgage, and we know insurance is important for people to bounce back and to be able to recover. And so one of the things that I do is work hard on our community rating service system score. And we did a flood insurance analysis. And we've done this a couple times over the years. And we were a little dismayed last year when we took a look at the results and saw that the number of policies were reduced by 22%. So it was about 10,000 policies. Prior studies had shown we had a really high rate of coverage across the city. And so we're kind of scratching our heads, wondering why, and we have a few theories. One, we know that risk rating 2.0 came out, and the cost of insurance is going up dramatically. And so there are people, a lot of houses on Miami Beach are not the first house, and they might be second mortgages, second homes, and they maybe don't have to have that coverage, so they're just dropping it. Or they're going to private flood insurance. Or there are people that are just truly can't afford it. For example, we have a lot of 2 to 4 unit buildings. We have 14 historic districts. We have a lot of older properties, and we know that their rate of coverage is much lower. It's very expensive to insure these very low, very important and culturally important homes, on Miami Beach.
Maybe a question to all of you a little bit. We've talked basically about stressors, which are driving affordability and climate-related affordability, whether that's blue sky flooding or land use, we should talk about transportation at some point during this panel as well. But what do we think the effects of a shock will be? Another big hurricane impacting South Florida. What will the effects of a shock be on affordability?
I mean, I can speak to that. We're seeing that right now after Irma and Ian in the insurance market, right? We have seen our insurance premiums. You know, I used to put $750 a unit for operating costs per year for insurance. We're now, that was 5 years ago, I'm now putting $3,000 a unit. So my operating costs have tripled just to cover insurance, and we're going to see that again. The other thing that we saw after this last storm came through, that I think was Ian that went up the state, is the reinsurers pulled out. So the reinsurers are the insurance for the insurance companies, right? It's Berkshire Hathaway, it's Lloyd's of London. They agree to take some percentage of the risk for State Farm, let's say, right? So State Farm will cover the first $20,000 of loss of your house. Berkshire agrees to take the last $80,000 for a $100,000 house. That's how that works. The reinsurers went, oh no, we just got hit. So what we're seeing and what I am seeing right now is we can't find full coverage for our buildings because the reinsurers are coming in and saying, I was going to cover $80,000, but I'm now only going to cover $40,000, and you have to go out and find the other $40,000. It's becoming a big issue in construction. We have to have builder's risk. I have a $30 million construction project. I have to have builder's risk that covers $30 million. Just did a project in the Keys last year. I could only get builder's risk for half the project. So we had to build, we were on 2 sites. I had to build the first site first, get it off the insurance, and then do the second site. What does that do to my costs? If I have to drag this construction project out, and this is a small $2 million deal in the Keys, the insurance, the builder's risk was $350,000 for it. I have to tell you, if I had $2 million, I would have been the reinsurer on that deal. But we couldn't find an insurance company. It's a huge issue. So it's not only the cost; it's actually finding somebody who will insure you.
And just to add, I mean, we talk a lot about wind insurance because they have windstorm insurance, but flood's a different hazard. And so the way we approach insurance is through different hazards as opposed to kind of what they call multi-hazard policies, right? So you have to also figure out what came first, the wind or the water, which did most of the damage. And so you're seeing more and more that, folks, like a good example is folks will get rid of certain insurance coverage on their car. This happened in Fort Lauderdale. I live there. We got 26 inches of rain in about 6 hours, thousands of cars, but because car insurance went up so much, they got, I don't want to screw it up, I think they got rid of the comprehensive coverage, which was not required by law, and that's what covers flood. And so what's happening is people are making financial decisions, they're reducing coverage, but not understanding the long-term implications of that. And that's going to put more financial strain on things. We should also at some point talk about the fact that, when people rent, they generally don't ask their landlord if they have flood insurance, if the landlord has flood insurance. And so what we saw in Fort Lauderdale was a lot of renters whose landlord was like, I don't have the money to fix this. I don't know what you want me to do about it, waiting for FEMA. Meanwhile, you have a renter who's paying rent to you who now has to go find another home with first, last, and security. And so that becomes a huge issue as well from an affordability standpoint.
Sonia, you were up to your elbows after Hurricane Andrew. So what do you think the impact of the next climate shock is going to be on affordability?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to get us to solutions. So,
okay. So yeah, Hurricane Andrew and I arrived about 8 hours apart from each other. So it was an interesting
Who
way.
came first?
I did.
Okay.
landing and not knowing that there's a hurricane about to impact the place where you're landing in was a rather interesting experience in and of itself. But unfortunately, what we did see in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew was that there were great social and economic repercussions as a result of it, right? And even though Hurricane Andrew was, very tiny storm, it was a very strong storm, right, with gusts up to Category 5 winds, but it was a storm that was tiny by comparison to Irma, for example, that was covering half or a third of the state of Florida as it was coming in through the Gulf Coast. And yet we had some repercussions in part of our communities here with some coastal flooding. And so when you ask about potential shocks, because we know that our ocean waters, and I'm touching Alex's territory here, but as we know that our ocean waters are becoming warmer and warmer, that's of course fuel for these hurricanes. Some scientists think that that might mean increased frequency of them. They're not always on board on that one, but they all agree that it will intensify our storms, right? And so we can expect large hurricanes to come through, and the question is, are we ready for the socioeconomic impacts that we saw happen when it was a tiny storm through South Dade, and it still impacted much of our community because so many individuals moved from the region because they couldn't find any affordable housing solutions within that region. And that's how Fort Lauderdale's population grew all at once.
Okay, so let's, we framed the problem such that it is. Let's just start to talk a little bit about solutions. And maybe we'll start, because we've been talking about shocks, let's start a little bit with risk mitigation. And Amy, I know the beach, Miami Beach has been doing some interesting stuff around helping homeowners do property risk mitigation. Talk a little bit about that program.
Yes, and I think, on Miami Beach, we've done things that are unique from the public infrastructure perspective as well as private. And our strategy is to do both, So the public infrastructure side is really important. The east side of Miami Beach is our highest and most protective side. Our dunes are about 18 feet high. And then we go to the west all the way down to about 1.5 feet even in some areas. So we're extremely low. But we're doing these things like, improving our seawalls. We are putting in larger and better stormwater systems. We have 4 different neighborhoods that we've actually elevated streets. But we're concerned about private properties because 75% of our land is privately owned. And again, we have those 14 historic districts. That gives us our sense of place. Miami Beach is beautiful, but they're older and they are less resilient, and but they are probably the more affordable housing on Miami Beach. So the big challenge is, how do we help people reduce that risk, and how do we help them maybe reduce the day-to-day impact of some of these flooding issues that they're seeing. So we did start a new program. It's called the Private Property Adaptation Program. We call it Fight the Flood. Applications are open now if anyone lives on Miami Beach. But basically, we are incentivizing resilience. We are offering competitive grants of up to $20,000 for homeowners to do different flood mitigation and climate adaptation changes to their property. And we actually prioritize, lower income residents. We prioritize historic homes. We prioritize if it's a first home. So we're doing everything we can to get to the money to those that need it the most. And what that's done is a couple things. One, it's really created this awareness that flooding is an issue. We need to be aware of it, that there are solutions. We were really, really surprised at how many people applied, how many people have been interested, because it's not something in government we hear about a lot. There's a lot of other things we do. Right? We're doing all sorts of planning. We're doing our beach renourishment. We're doing our dune systems. We're doing sidewalks. We're doing our urban forest. But we don't necessarily, we don't do private properties. And so for us to hear the experiences people had and their concern has been huge. And there is a problem. There is an issue, and people are concerned. So we've been able to give them an assessment, a flood risk assessment. And actually, Alec and his company is our prime contractor for that, and to really look at their properties, and they're all very, very different. Maybe one property could benefit greatly from a rain garden. Maybe they have standing water, they have an issue there. Maybe another needs to do wet flood proofing, or they need to elevate their appliances. We even had 2 homes that have qualified for a FEMA home elevation grant, fully paid for through that program. And believe it or not, that is groundbreaking work in Miami, the broader Miami, in Miami Beach too. We're not seeing things like home elevation. We're not seeing a lot of this work. So we're also trying to almost create the industry as we do this program.
I also want to add building codes. Like, we have our new construction projects, the projects that I'm building right now, I'm going to go sit in the hallway of those when a hurricane comes. Like, I am not worried about those buildings going anywhere.
Because you are mandated to build to that standard?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are mandated. I think we're at 160 mile per hour winds. It's concrete. It is absolutely a solid building. We're mandated to be out of the floodplain, and in my business, we're encouraged to get as far out of the floodplain as we can because our flood insurance rates go down, right? So we're bringing stuff way out of the floodplains. And you can see that after Ian, I was flying back from Tallahassee, and we flew over Fort Myers Beach. And you could see the communities that were recently built there. I don't know if they got flooded, but they were still standing. And then you could see communities where there were just foundations left. And that was the difference between those old building codes and our new building codes. It's very expensive to build, right? Very expensive to build. But when a hurricane comes, we're not going to be paying as much for the repairs for those.
If I can turn it on, I can add. And on wind, we're amazing, and we need to catch up from the water side. And that's what we're learning now. So a lot of our building codes from a flood perspective are from FEMA, and FEMA's regulation really comes from riverine flooding, not coastal flooding, not rainfall flooding. So a lot of what we can and can't do, it's built into our building codes, doesn't necessarily apply that well to the coastal environment we're in. But the reality is the best thing you can do is elevate.
Yeah, so I just wanted to tag on to that, if I may. Because in fact, going back to Hurricane Andrew, and the School of Architecture had deployed a lot of individuals to South Dade. We had 16 charrettes that happened back to back. And so we were out there in South Dade for quite a long time. And then after that, I spent 2 years with a nonprofit going into the field every day. And what we noticed is that not all the buildings within the same flood zone performed in the same way. So it was clear to us, and clearly our bias as architects shifts us in that direction, but we could identify very quickly that it had more to do than just whether you were sitting in the FEMA firm zone X or Y or Z, VE, AE, whatever, A. So therefore, our study continued to look at, years later, at how the aspects of the building design intersect with the flood criteria, the exposure, what we call the exposure criteria. And that's why we developed the storm surge building vulnerability model. So at the level of parcels, we can actually identify how those building aspects are contributing to making that building more or less resilient. And what we learned is that in fact, it's the buildings that were built post-World War II up until the 1994 building codes were adjusted. Those are the buildings that actually incurred the greatest amount of damage throughout our communities. And so when folks are saying that old historic buildings need to be replaced, that's actually incorrect. We know that those historic buildings actually outperform those that were built after in that specific period. Yeah.
So square that up, and Sonia, we'll keep this with you. Square that up with affordability now. We're in this massive affordability moment.
Right.
And so we want our affordable buildings to last because if, low income, vulnerable people can get back in apartments that stand, they will be less impacted by the shock.
Right.
But what are the pathways to affordability more generally?
So I've brought 3 different case studies, if we can cue up the first one of those. And each one of these case studies has a different strategy to think about affordability. And this one, it was a case study site that we did with the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact when I led their Resilient Redesign 3 charrette. And it was looking at the community of Arch Creek. And what we came up with was this idea of inclusive policies and processes. So that if you tied, for example, things that already exist, like a transfer of development right program, but you set that up so that there was an earnest sort of communication and consultations with the community members, so that then those community members could be involved in sort of framing that TDR program. And on the other hand, the developers could get those additional air rights that would further, make it attractive for them to build more affordable housing because you were requiring it of them. But you were also saying that those air rights had to come from those properties that are already being impacted within your neighborhood that you're intending to build, right? And in the case of Arch Creek, there's some areas that are very impacted by floodwaters already because they're sitting at barely 2 to 4 feet on average above mean sea level. So we know that that would mean that if we closed that loop and made it so that those owners that sold those rights were given priority in having access to the affordable housing that was built in that project, that's one of the many tools. It's not a complete picture, but it gives you an idea of how you can cobble that together with other strategies to build higher density in certain parts of our community along that ridge. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how over time that could evolve so that that water starts to become more and more present in the community. You can have different strategies of how you incorporate the water within that community. In the next slide, if you can see that we essentially acknowledge that way down into the future there will be much less land available to us, and so we want to make sure that we get it right from the beginning so that we have a mix of different uses and different housing types, including affordable and workforce housing within those communities. And I think this is an important thing for our students to take away, and that is that, we should always keep in mind that nature actually retains a memory of where she's been. And we may not want to acknowledge that. We may choose to ignore that, but her memory is better than ours, right? And so we have to keep that in mind.
So maybe Hannah, I would throw it to you and say, what are as someone who's like closest to the coalface on this issue, what are the things that you need either from local or state government that will help you both, build climate resilient housing but also affordable housing?
Money, money, money. I mean, that's really what it is. What's happening now is as operating expenses and insurance prices are going up, right? That leaves less cash to pay for debt. So I don't have as much debt, I need more subsidy. So it is money. Honestly, also time is money. So to get us through these processes quicker would be really helpful.
What are some examples of where that happens, but developers don't run roughshod over the community? Because usually that's like a tension, right? So how do you balance that?
Yeah, so for me, it's not even, when you're calling us running roughshod,
okay.
right? That's when we're going through zoning hearings and site plan approvals. Yeah. That part to me is not actually the issue. It's when we get into like Durham, and I sit in Durham for 10 months, right, waiting. So just being able to speed up those processes to get us out would be really helpful. Infrastructure grants would be really helpful when you're talking about these water retention plans that we have to do. We're doing one right now on a site. I mean, we're digging way down to put these trenches in, right? But it really comes down, I hate to say this, it comes down to money. We can talk about density, we can talk about all sorts of stuff, but if you want something to be affordable for somebody, I got to be able to keep the rents low, so I've got to have subsidy to pay for the capital improvements.
Yeah. I'm going to let you react to that because I can see you edging forward on your chair. But I want to say that this will end the panel part of the conversation and make sure that people are queued up to ask a couple of good questions.
Just bringing it to the affordable housing resilience nexus and policy, a couple years ago, the state passed the Always Ready program, which has put billions of dollars towards infrastructure, specifically resilient infrastructure. And what's really fascinating about it is when we passed the resilience law as a state, we also guaranteed $200 million a year to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And a lot of folks had mixed feelings because it was originally all for affordable housing, but frankly, the state rated the money every year, and I think in the previous 5 years had done about $50 million a year. You might know the exact numbers.
Yeah, they actually haven't rated it for a while, but yes, we can have a discussion about that.
It was one of those moments where you literally pinned resilience and affordable housing almost against each other. Made it very hard. It was probably politically smart. But the hope is that on both sides, there'll be more funding in the future because, frankly, with the amount of affordable housing we need well above the 500 million maximum we've seen.
And can I just close this out? I am a huge advocate in affordable housing to do whatever we can and whatever we can afford to make our properties resilient. Because our folks, if my house got hit, I'll go to Maryland for a while, right? Like I have the resources that I can go do something else. Right. Our people do not have resources to go anyplace else, and we need to make these resilient as possible. Yeah. It's very expensive to do.
This is trying to break the vicious cycle of shocks and stresses. Go ahead, Sonia.
Very quickly, I think that one of the aspects, and maybe if they can cue up the last slide that was up there, you also need to be able to communicate with your members in the community, right? Because the more aware they are of their challenges, the more ready they are to make choices. And sometimes, depending on their capacities, those choices might go in one direction or the other. And so communicating, consistently dialoguing with, and making sure that your community members are participating in decision-making processes in ways that are thoughtful and mindful and purposeful are very important. And this is just an example of a pamphlet that we gave over to the city of Miami Beach a few years ago. It's one of 6, I think, different pamphlets that we've done that look at different historic styles, different building typologies, as well as different geological conditions and sites. And they're usually 16 to 20 page pamphlets, but they try to give all the resources to the community members so that they know what to do. And empowering the residents, I think, is one of the most important responsibilities we have.
All right, so let's see, are there questions?
Hello. Thank you so much for the discussion. So something you were saying to begin with was that developers are naturally going to look towards the X zones or the zones where there's less flood risk. I think a primary concern that we're seeing is when you have regions that aren't as vulnerable, you're not really going to go to the affluent communities that have had the same family living in one house for 3 generations. You're going to go to the struggling communities that have been facing decades of disparities and are now struggling to afford rent. And so naturally in those communities, it's going to be much easier to convince them, hey, just move, we'll give you this money, it's cool, and we'll put a new building here, or we'll put a new apartment here. So how can we ensure that our future designers and scientists and people that are coming in with numbers and plans are also taking into account the existing social vulnerabilities of communities to ensure we're not just displacing the same people whenever we need a climate resilient solution?
Yeah. So I'll start that conversation. I think that we were having this conversation in class today, right? We were talking about our social vulnerabilities. We were thinking back about Nicole Crook and her participation in our class earlier this week, where she was talking to us about the challenges that Catalyst faces when they're trying to partner with community members and inform them. And in fact, those nonprofits have a big role, whether it's Clio or Catalyst or some of the others, in bringing information to our residents sooner rather than later. Will there be hard choices for families who are in dire straits to sell their property? Yes, that's logical. But would more information about how our communities evolve, would starting up different trusts within our communities help? Are there other mechanisms that we can introduce into our neighborhoods before the pressures really mount, in order to buttress those communities? That's where I think we start, right?
I mean, the question of displacement and gentrification is got to be one of the hardest in urbanism more generally in this country because of the free market systems that govern, and when we meddle in that in ways, it has all these other impacts that aren't good for the community that we're trying to help. And so I've seen, some like in Oakland, there's some middle class like incentives and tax incentives to keep people in their homes that the city has been offering. But I mean, this is an open question. What are the best anti-displacement policies that are working? Forget about climate for a second, just in general in our cities that are improving. There are few and far between really good examples in this country. And so I think it's a really important thing. We have other questions.
I just want to quickly add, so one of the hardest things that you noted is that the way you create more housing is through density to reduce, right? You create more supply, but then if you zone something that's single family into multifamily, you then further incentivize kind of gentrification. I want to give a shout out to Representative James Buchanan. He's a Florida State Representative. He has a bill on resilience districts. I helped craft, and one of the things it was about transitioning mobile home parks into more resilient housing, and one of the parts about the bill that they made sure was that there was non-displacement clauses in any money that the government would be giving. And one of the things we can start looking at is as government gives out grants and loans, especially to developers, saying, hey, you need to actually have a non-displacement plan, whatever that looks like, whether it's moving people locally or back into whatever you build. But for a long time, we just give folks land, kick folks out of, especially, fabricated housing. And that's a challenge we have to kind of really think about.
I would just say that until you address zoning and you get more density, if people want to live in a city and you want to keep the city whether resilient or sustainable or anything, you have to increase the density. And density, when you increase it, can keep people in the same neighborhoods if the social impact is so strange. That's the end of it all. I mean, people talk around in circles. I've sat in these kinds of conferences all over the United States and all over Europe even. And I lived in Prague for 12 years, just as the communists left. And we found a great solution. We would take a townhouse, which the communists said you had to have 2 apartments a floor, and you couldn't build, and these were things where rich people owned the whole building for 5 floors. They changed it with communism. Now we leave communism, and all of a sudden, when I said to them, these are such strong structures, I'll put an elevator in, and I can add 3 more floors, and we're not going to displace anybody. Zoning got changed. Or we got a house over here and a house over here, and I have the equivalent of 30 feet between it. And we have these enormous backyards. Why can't we put another house there? So it's all about zoning if you want to keep and live in a environment, and everybody's moving to cities. And cities, it's ridiculous to have a single-family house in a city. Los Angeles is doing a lot of this type of zoning, allowing a second, what started as it was your mother-in-law's house or this or that, or your kids. Now everybody's building. I mean, in Newport Beach, they're putting in where the homes are worth $15 million. They're building another house on their property. It's all about zoning. And one other thing, which I brought up last week and the week before, I'm doing a project right now in the Virgin Islands, and we start with the first person I hired were 2 people, a sustainability guru and a resiliency guru. And actually the guy named Ilya Azimov, who was running for AIA president this year. And the reason is when I take the 2 of them with me as the architect and sit down with the people who count, who were the approve the master plan, they said, well, you already have the team here, so let's figure out how to make it work. Nobody cares about those things in most of mainland America, and certainly not in Florida.
We're almost at time. I want to squeeze in 2 questions, and then we'll get reactions from the panel.
Hi. My question is for Hannah. You were talking about raising your buildings and, getting, the prices down for that building as far as insurance when you do that, just because flood zones and stuff. So my question is, do you do that with fill, or do you do that with other, things?
Yeah. It really depends. I hand it to the civil engineers and I say, what do y'all think? Right? We do the geotech, we figure it out. In the Keys, we're putting everything up on piers because, like Miami Beach, it's at 0, at sea level, and so we're putting it up 9 feet. On a site that we're working on right now, we're probably going to bring in a foot or two of fill. We're still going to end up putting piers way down into the coral rock, but we're probably going to do it on fill. You also have to deal with ADA issues, right? So I've got to either elevator it or I got to be able to ramp up to it, and so that's a big consideration.
And I would just add, we've tried both on Miami Beach, and I think I may have a picture of our floodplain manager, and you can see how tall he is, and then his head is like the first finished floor, and that's going to be somebody's living room. Like, that's how tall it is, this one. That's new construction. So that is an understory, and that's where probably underneath that is just like open. It could be area that they use to park a car or have like an outside area.
It actually has to be open,
Yeah.
because otherwise your flood insurance gets, you can park your car, but it's got to be open down there.
And we've also tried fill and having minimum lot elevations, but that creates more of an issue throughout, I think, kind of harmonizing the different properties to each other and to the public property. It's like you have this kind of hill in the middle of an old, low neighborhood. But that, I mean, the picture right next to it, I took that picture from a boat during high tides. And that just shows how low some of our existing properties can be, which is pretty scary, right? I mean, you can't even see their seawall. That's like water going right into the property. But it just shows that dramatic. Excuse me? Probably. The water will be up there. So,
So my question, I'm Joanna, and I'm the last question that's the formal question, but then I think a lot of people are going to want to come up and talk to you privately, because that always happens after class, right, everybody? My question is really, has anybody studied the impact of the California laws that allow the ADUs as long as it's your house and you stay there? Do you know, Alec? I'm asking you this actually because you study everything. Is there something on that?
I haven't. I know we have a lot of conversations locally about ADUs and what they mean. One of the challenges is lately, I think some of the stuff I've seen is that ADUs don't necessarily reduce housing costs overall, because there's just not enough supply, right, to make that impact. It's zoning and density. It's a solution, but it isn't the solution. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, in Florida, we're still grappling with the Live Local Act and understanding how we're going to implement that, which completely changed zoning, So I think there's... Yes, and there's a lot of questions.
I would add, though, I do think something that's missing is this conversation of local. So we can have an academic conversation about density, but truly a community is going to make its own decisions on what it's going to allow and not allow. And, I can tell you Miami Beach electeds don't want density. The people that live there, they don't want more density. There's already too many tourists, right? There's already too much traffic. So to add more and more people onto that, it's not necessarily attractive. And we're also in an evacuation zone. So we have to think, how many more people do we really want to fit on this little island? And so much of that local, because we've had those conversations on Miami Beach about, allowing the mother-in-law or father-in-law quarters on, and how do we allow that? But, it becomes an issue for the actual neighborhood.
Great. So with that, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists, Sonia, Maddie, and everyone for...
Salon series for next year. Amy Knoll is here with me now because we will be partnering and co-hosting next year's series on coastal urban resilience. So we hope you will join us. There will be many of these topics that will perhaps surface again, and others that we hope to bring into the fold. I want to be very grateful to our wonderful partners at the U.S. Department of HUD for their partnership throughout this series. We look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all. I want to be very thankful to Michael and his support of us here at the School of Architecture and for being here this evening to moderate this session. Thank you all. Amy, do you have any final words?
Come next year and you can learn anything you ever wanted to learn about Miami Beach and all the different ways that we're really addressing and preparing for our coastal resilience. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. With that said, thank you very much. Bye-bye. And thank you, Madeline Lee, for making all of this happen. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.